And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Phillip Hasheider, who during his near-death experience went to another dimension, which we're going to talk about and more. Phillip, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's a very good pleasure to me to be able to speak with you and share my story.
Well, we're excited to have you. And if you don't mind, Phillip, can we start on the day that you died and go from there?
It was an early October morning. And the last thing I thought would happen to me is that I'd find myself in a completely different dimension with a unique experience. I had been out in our pasture with our cattle, decided to go into town to do an exercise at our hospital's local fitness rehab center. And I had been going there for 9 months. And I found myself standing next to the arm curl machine because I had just finished. And what was unusual is my forearms started tingling like they had fallen asleep. And I remember looking down at them. And that was the last thing I remembered until very late that night. It was during that period of time that I was lying on the floor that I found myself in another dimension. And I know what happened to me while I was lying on the floor because I had secured all my medical reports to try to understand exactly what happened. Essentially, I stood there next to the machine, collapsed, and that was it, and I was gone. And then the next thing I realized or understood was that I was in some place I had not been before, and it certainly wasn't the exercise room.
What did it look like?
Well, I first have to explain that my explanation of what I experienced and saw was really difficult to explain. It was easy for me to explain what happened to me just falling over in the exercise room. But getting to a dimension where there's no vocabulary, there's no use of human words, there's no real discussion of anything. Everything is through energetic transformation, exchange of information. There are no words. So what I describe is trying to find the best human words that we share that would have a similar meaning amongst other people, or a close approximation of those words as I could find to explain it. What I found was I ended up on what I can best describe as a little raft. And I was floating on these waves that were coming at me like energy waves. And they were undulating, going up and down, and I was just floating along like I was on a sea. But it wasn't a sea of water, it was a sea of energy. And I remember thinking, well, this is really interesting. But at that point, I don't have any recollection of knowing that I had died. I mean, I was just in some place other than where I was, and it was in a place that I had never even had a dream about. So what was this all about? And while I was sitting on this raft, if you will, I felt nothing but peace, complete love, and I couldn't understand where it was coming from. But there was no anxiety. It was quiet at first, and I was trying to understand exactly, in human terms, exactly where I was. Well, as I was looking at these energy waves, they were coming at me. And they were not only coming at me, they were going through me, and they were passing through and continuing on. But I didn't feel like I was being invaded by anything. It just felt warm. Like if you come in from the cold, extreme cold, and you go take a hot shower, you get this energy coming down your whole being and feeling peaceful, warmth inside. And even today, now, a few years later, I can think of that time and I get this welling up inside of me of this extreme warmth. And so I know that the experience was true because I cannot help but replicate that same feeling when I think about it. So I was sitting there, and several things happened almost at once. And one was I noticed, I looked up and I noticed there was no sky. There was no stars. There were no anything. It was just a big theater. If you can imagine a theater the immensity of multiple universes in just in that space, that's pretty much what it was. Not only was this such a huge theater, there was in front of me this huge glowing orangish yellow, best described as a sun, but it was bigger than that. It was like a million suns combined together. It was that big. It was that immense. It went up as far to the edge of where I could see, but I could still see it all, even though I was still in front of it. And from this energy were these waves coming out and passing through me. And it was that recognition that I thought, well, this has to be some sort of divine source of energy, because where else could it come from? Some people might call it God, which is fine. Some people might call it the source of all creation. Whatever a person can label it as, that was it. And not only was it glowing and immense, I was close enough that I could almost touch it, but I wasn't getting burned up. I mean, it wasn't that kind of a fiery energy. It was just an electric sort of thing that kept me floating where I was. I was basically anchored to it and didn't realize it at the time. One of the other things that I noticed when I looked around was that from this energy, this huge globe of energy, were all these little sparks coming out all over, millions of them. And I took that to be something akin to myself, that here I was sitting watching this, but still being a part of it. And that little spark to me was another entity that was coming out of this creation energy. And what I describe it as in my book is that it's the nest of the creator, and that this is where we all come from. So after I had taken in that sort of thing, I finally decided to look around and see what was behind me. And what I saw was best described as eternity. There was no end, but it was like I was given a magnifying glass to look past it and into the distance. And the farther I looked, the clearer it became. Then an interesting thing happened, which, I was able to recall later. Looking at everything around me, we had this giant globe of energy. Now, I was only seeing it from the one side, but I assumed that everything on the other side was the same. So you have, in human terms, you have a ball, so it's going to be round. And so I took that to mean that there's another side that I wasn't seeing. So I assumed that everything I was seeing on this side was also happening on the other side. The thing that struck me was when I was looking at, in terms, human terms of up, down, sideways, left, right, those don't exist in that dimension. But that's the best way I can describe what I saw. Because if, and I'm going to ask you to consider this example of, if you take our entire universe, what we know to be this universe, and squeeze it down into a thin sheet of paper, or the size of a thin sheet of paper, and suspend it out in the eternal dimension. And then take another universe, compress that down, and set that right next to it. Take another one, do the same thing, and keep going in an infinite direction one way, an infinite direction in another way, an infinite direction as we would refer to top or down. That's what I saw. And connecting all these were little spider web-like filaments that all reached back to this glowing source of all creation. So to me, it was that this source is pumping its energy into all these different dimensions that I was seeing. Now I was just in one, but afterwards, after I, I started writing about what I experienced, it came to me that this is where we all originate from, the source of all creation. Every one of us, we are the DNA. Each one of us carries the DNA of the Creator, which has a lot of ramifications, implications here in this dimension, in that we are not separate. We are all one. We come from the same source. So I've been asked how long I felt I was there. The best answer I can give is, it felt like I was there centuries. People, and then I was asked, well, how can you not know time was passing? Well, first of all, there is no time or space in that dimension. It just is. Yeah, I think if an easy way may be to understand it, if you go to a movie and you are so immersed in the subject matter, all of a sudden the movie's over and you wonder what happened to the 2 hours. It was very much similar where I was. I was completely immersed in what was going on, and it felt like it was centuries had gone by. Well, during the whole time that I was in this dimension, back in the fitness room in the rehab center, there were 5 staff members of the facility and 11 EMTs working to pull me back. Now, I don't figure they understood where I was, and they probably didn't care because they were just trying to get my heart restarted. And come to find out later, and in order to understand the timeline of all this, I went and got my medical reports and the EMT reports, and come to find out, it took them over 6 minutes to get my heart restarted. And that included the CPR and 3 electrical shocks. So while I was not there, while I felt like I was in that dimension for centuries, it was only 6 minutes, a little over 6 minutes of our time here, human time, that I was actually lying on the floor dead. Once I got my heart restarted, then they, took me to, I was conveyed to an ER and then on ICU later that day. So that is what I saw. I mean, there's really more to it than that, but the essence of what I experienced is those things. And even now, today, I can think back to them and nothing has changed. Nothing of what I experienced has changed. And people can say, and I've been asked, well, do you think you imagine that? And I say, no, I can't possibly imagine that I could come up with that sort of scenario, that sort of a area to describe if I hadn't actually been there. And for what it's worth, I have had one interview where the person who had read the description said it was the best and most intricate description of another dimension that he had read or heard. So I'm pleased with that, because I wanted to be very sure that what I experienced was true, because I didn't want to be deceived. And I didn't want to deceive myself. And I certainly, least of all, wanted to deceive someone else with a false narrative. So I was very careful when I started writing about my experience, because it took a long time to put it all together and in a coherent form, because it's a hard subject to try to formulate into words. So my best application is to ask people to experience the words with the embedded energy of those words, from where I came with my story. Now, words have different meanings to different people, and that's why I asked them to look at the words in the context of what's coming. And I think the energy from that whole experience will come through with the words.
Phillip, thank you for sharing your experience with us. Was the transition of you collapsing in the gym and then you being aware that you're on a raft timeless or instantaneous? Or was there some few seconds of blackness and then you're there?
That's really a good question. To me, it was instantaneous, because one moment I was standing there looking at my forearms. The next moment I remember I was in this raft. I mean, it was like I just left home without anything. I don't recall that I asked to do that, but it was part of the whole experience. So no, there was no pain. I mean, people have had traumatic accidents and that sort of thing where before they passed, but for me, I just collapsed right there and I was gone, and I didn't feel any pain. In fact, when I got to that dimension, I actually felt better. I mean, it was so welcoming, it was so loving, it was so warm. I didn't realize, it took me a while to realize that, this really isn't where I was before. And so there was, it was instantaneous. Yeah,
Wow.
there was no, I did not see any black area where I had to transition through. It was like I went through a very thin energetic veil sheet that was translucent and just went right through it into another dimension. I mean, what I found is that now I can look back on that and I can still go there. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to drop over. I can just sit and I can actually go there, because it's become part of my background to everything. It's like this dimension is right there, but it takes different eyes to see it, which is one of the things that I realized, that all of my experience from my past, from when I was a child until that morning, all of those experiences, all of those threads of what I had done focused itself to that moment in the fitness center. And when I collapsed, I basically, what I understand is I passed through a prism. All this focus zipped through this prism, and I came out with a completely different set of eyes in how I look at everything. Now, had they not brought me back physically, I'd still be there. I'd be on to my next journey. But that I'm back, I'm grateful for that. I wouldn't wish an NDE on anybody, but for me, it really was beneficial, because it made me more aware of not only this dimension, but what else is out there and the possibilities that exist.
While you were there, did you forget about Phillip Hasheider and your life here as if it never existed?
I would say yes. And I've come to the conclusion that's for a couple of reasons. If I had known, perhaps if I had known I was going to stay there longer, maybe I would have thought about things back here. But no, I did not think of anybody here. I did not recall incidents of my life. Other people have, and that's fine. I can only explain my experience. And as you said, when we were talking, this is not a competition of who can have the number of NDEs or the vividness of them or whatever. And so we only have our own unique experiences. But no, I did not think of my family that I recall. Now I'll come back to that in just a second. But I didn't recall things I had done. I didn't have a back life experience that I'm aware of. I didn't have a future experience of what some people have had, at least not that I'm aware of. Now, being aware of these things may come later, but at this point in time, I haven't had that recall, and it's fine with me. I mean, I'm satisfied with what I experienced, and I go from there.
Since you didn't remember your current life, to me that would mean that you wouldn't even have the understanding that you were dead either.
Oh, that's true. I didn't. When Now this happened at roughly 11 o'clock in the morning. When I finally came to again, came with the realization that something had happened to me, it was 8 o'clock at night. And I remember that because I looked at the wall clock and it said 8 o'clock. Now, later, my wife explained to me, and also the EMTs that I interviewed and the staff people that I interviewed, about what they had done. They said I was talking with them in the ambulance, answering questions. Then I got to the ER, and the doctor was asking questions, and I was answering with them. I was joking. They all said I looked normal. They couldn't understand why I did because of what happened, but my vital signs all dropped back down to normal. So I have this 8-hour segment that I have no recollection whatsoever. And at this stage, it's not really that important because I had enough other feedback from people to explain what was going on, even though I can't remember it. why I remember 8 o'clock was because I told, and my wife was taking notes too, because she had finally gotten to the ER room. I had told the one doctor that that couldn't be possible because time doesn't run backwards, at least not in this dimension. And she said the doctor had this puzzled look on his face and then said, well, it's 8 o'clock at night, not in the morning. And boy, that was really confusing because I was just starting to sense that, well, something had happened to me, but also that time made no sense whatsoever.
Do you recall any of the transition coming back to your body?
No, no, because it falls within that 8 hour window when I just don't have any recollection. No, I don't remember coming back into my body. I don't remember anything for the next 8 hours, and that still is gone. Now, one thing I will mention, and I use an example like this. Say our brains have, okay, 8 gigabytes memory, and all of a sudden you're exposed, or I was exposed to knowledge, information that was 1,000,000 megabytes in the other dimension. So I come back and I have some form of this, but not the total picture, because what would happen if all of that information is shoved into my brain? Well, it probably would crash, and that wouldn't be useful to me or anyone else. So I really believe that there's more that I will eventually learn as time goes on, but maybe not. That's to be seen. But the same way, I don't have any recollection of actually finally coming back to life, other than when the AED monitor with the EMTs said that my heart was beating again.
The way I interpret your description of the universe, or the multiple universes lined up side by side, is that there are parallel universes. And if I'm correct with that, do you think a part of you exists in each one of those parallel universes at the same time?
I think your description is quite accurate. Do I think I exist in multiple dimensions at the same time? It's possible. I really believe that now more than I could ever believe before, because of having seen this. Now, if you think about it, and I would ask people to think in these terms, if you have an infinite amount of space, you can allow for an infinite amount of dimensions, which means you can allow for an infinite amount of experiences and possibly, probably, an infinite amount of identities. Now, in connection with that, if I were going to try to explain how I got here, first of all, I would say I have lived eternally, such as you have and everyone else who has existed on this planet. We have lived an eternal life because we were created by that source of all creation, which is an eternal source. Now, that's a really hard concept for humans to get their mind around, because we're conditioned to understand beginnings and endings. And to have something before and something after is really not within a lot of people's ability to grasp. I'm not saying they can't. It's not something we think about all the time. We just look at beginnings and endings. But what was before we were born? We existed before we were born here. One of the things I realized was that the body is more than the sum of its parts. While I was standing next to the machine, It was my body. While I was lying on the floor, basically dead, was my body. Well, what was the difference? Something was missing. And the part that was missing was the spark, the soul, if you will, that had gone from the body, my body, because it was lying on the floor. It had gone back to this dimension. And then when they got my heart restarted again, it came back. And that's why I am what I am, just like anyone else. And so I think if you wonder about eternity, it has existed in our lifetime before and will exist again. And if you think of it in another way, if you think about your grandparents or great grandparents, at some point they thought they would not be alive, and that what was after them would be eternity. We are actually living in their eternity. So we are already living in an eternal state.
After you came back and you processed what had happened, how did your life change?
Well, once I realized something significant had happened, it really was devastating to my family and my friends until they heard that I was still alive. Then it was a matter of relief. For me personally, my life just changed from understanding, from what my understanding of life was before to completely new life, that things were much, much different. The residual effects were felt by my family. Now, my friends, not so much, because they had heard what happened and then found out I was okay. And when I saw them, they would see me as normal because all my vital signs went back to normal. And I was walking, I was joking. So, they thought, well, he's okay, but it was my family, my wife and that who really bared the brunt of the consequences of what happened to me that morning. Because my whole world fell into my wife's lap instantaneously. She then had to deal with our farm, the farm work, the finances, being all of a sudden becoming a caregiver that she hadn't anticipated that morning when she went to work. I mean, she had a full-time job, so she was really running at three different ends, and so that was the biggest impact on our family. It wasn't me. I mean, I was fine, or I felt fine, but she was left with a lot of stuff to deal with, and she has her own story to tell about that, because I'm sure there are other spouses who feel the same way, that they were basically, I don't want to say neglected, they were put in the background because all the care was attention to me. The attention was directed to me. And the best word would be, while I felt okay and was healing, I was pretty much oblivious to a lot of stuff, and that over time created a lot of frustration between us, because Mary could never understand my experience, even if I explained it to her. She still couldn't feel it. She could hear it, but it wasn't her experience. And I couldn't understand her experience of seeing me laying in the ER room, watching me try to come back to some mental stability, being able to physically get around again, and wondering, what she would find when she got home from work. Would I still be alive? I mean, where would I be? Would I be out trampled by the cattle because I got amongst them? So I was not allowed to deal with cattle too much, or machinery. So it became basically a sleep deprived part of her life.
Well, how did your life change spiritually and or religiously after you came back?
I was, I would say I became more spiritually attuned to the universe and what I experienced. Um, since that time, and this is not a knock on anyone, but organized religion doesn't have the appeal to me anymore. Uh, being spiritual can bring you a sense of peace, a sense of non-judgment. So those are probably the two biggest ways it's changed me in that aspect.
Do you fear death at all?
Not a bit, not a bit. And hopefully that's what I can help people understand, that this is not the end, even if we discard this body. Uh, there is a future because we've had an eternal past. We will have an eternal future. Now, I realize that's hard for people to understand, and it's probably difficult for people who are going through physical challenges at this point in time. But once you release that fear, it really sets you free. So that is one of the things that the prism did for me. It released all these angst, anxieties, fears of whatever might happen to me. Do I want to leave? No, not necessarily. But I know now that if I do leave again, okay, I'll just keep going on to another dimension. Um, I like to use an example of back in 1951, I took the energetic superhighway and took the off ramp and came into this dimension to learn. I was born of my parents. I was raised by them. I've had my life now for 72 years here. And when my body uses up all of its fuel, which it will do, I will get back on that super energetic superhighway on ramp, and I'm going to go to the next dimension, my next learning experience, because that's what we're here for, is to learn. We're not here to be punished. I did not see any of that. People can believe what they want, and that's fine, but I did not see any evidence of dark places, because in the light of the source, the creator, there is no dark space.
If you had a friend that was suffering over the loss of a loved one, what type of advice would you give?
Well, that's really an interesting question. It's not going to be a one sentence thing, but and it may not sound most empathetic, but my question would be, and I've asked this of myself, who are you trying to appease by feeling that bad? Is it your feelings that you're losing something that you want to prevent having lost? Have you asked that person if they want to leave? A lot of times well, I shouldn't, I'm not going to categorize that, but a lot of times I think people are most grievous because they feel like they've lost something. And they probably have lost the connection for feelings in the future. But that also means that they're trying to withhold this person from leaving and continuing their journey. And so I don't think, quite frankly, I think it's very selfish to ask someone to stay who's on the way to passing into another dimension. Now, yeah, we can feel a loss because we won't be able to talk to them in the same way again. We won't be able to have dinner with them or maybe shake their hand. Why not do those things now while they're still here? So it can serve as a something that people can do now while people are around them. For someone who's on the way passing, the amount of grief you're feeling is not going to stop them from going because that's their journey. It's not the other person who is upset. Now, grieving, I think, is a very valid human emotion because it allows us to release uh, things inside ourselves that could be uh, physically detrimental if handled in the wrong way or kept inside over a lifetime. So I understand that. But to me, now at this stage, from my experience, it's a matter of asking oneself, is it because of my wanting them not to leave that I'm grieving? Or is it because I'm just grieving for that person and not knowing what's going to happen? From my experience, yeah, there's no reason to fear death. I know people do, but it's because we're afraid we're losing something. But we're not losing anything. We're just losing our body. And from what I saw, I'm not taking any of the stuff I have with me. So it's all going to be left behind. So what do I have to lose? Uh, yeah, I have a certain amount of time here. But after that time, I'm going to be somewhere else. Does that sound crass? I don't know. It's just the way I feel. And from my experience, that's what's going to happen. And yeah, I'm happy with that. Do I want to leave tomorrow? Not necessarily. I've got my family and friends. Yeah, I want to see them too. But if I go, it's going to be great. So I would like to leave people with the hope that there is continued life beyond this dimension, only in a different form. I mean, you've changed from when you were a child. You're just going to change from an adult into uh, another energetic form that you are. You're going to shed this body, and it's going to be great.
Your book is called 6 Minutes in Eternity. What is the main takeaway that you would like the reader to get from your book?
That there is hope. That is why I've realized that's why I came back. And this came from a conversation with my wife. Well, it wasn't actually a conversation. It was a statement I had made during the middle of the night. And she was prescient enough to keep a notepad and a pencil by the nightstand. And she said, I woke up in the middle of the night and said, I don't believe this. And she said, well, don't believe what? And she said, I replied, I don't believe I came here to do that. And she said, what is it you came to do? And she said that I told her that I was asked to come back to be a conduit of hope for those who don't have any. And I said, well, what happened then? Well, you just laid back down and went to sleep, like nothing happened. And she told me this next morning. And then it all made sense to me about why I returned, because I had been asking that question. I mean, why couldn't I stay? What is I'm supposed to do? So that is what I'm offering in my book, is hope. It comes back to everything that I experienced, everything that I've tried to explain. Uh, it's just what I can offer because that's what I saw. And having seen that dimension, I cannot unsee it. Having experienced the feelings in that dimension, I cannot unexperience those feelings in that dimension. I mean, it's with me every day, and it's a companion. I've gotten used to it. And every time I look, it's right there, right in back of the background of what I'm looking at. I mean, we're just a step away from that next dimension.
Would you say that it's Like a television set, and if you just change the channel, then you would see it? It's like right here with us?
Well, I would say it's right here with us. Yeah, it's like if I could take a step off a cliff and walk right through it. That's really what it is for me. To change a channel, well, I don't know. Well, there are probably an infinite number of channels. So yeah, you could keep flipping through until you found one you liked. Do I understand how the soul knows where it wants to go? No, no, I don't have all those answers, and I would hesitate to uh, embrace someone who said they had all the answers, because I don't think anyone does.
If you
That's
com-
my opinion. That's my opinion.
if you compare this side to that side, would they be the same, or would one be more real and the other one would be more dreamlike?
Well, it was very real to me when I was in that dimension. So, in that sense, I would say it's very real. There are things here that I don't think are real, but uh, most of the time, what I see is, solid. It's a denser dimension. That's why we have to go from the state I was in that other dimension, to this one. I had to drop down several layers to become this body, because we have to have this body. Let me rephrase that. Our soul has to have this body to be able to experience this dimension in the same way we do. It can be here, but not necessarily experiencing a desk or a interview. It could observe all these things, but not participate in the same way as a human body does. And that's why we come through our parents. We're part of that species, so that we can embrace everything that goes on with a human activity. So to me, it was so real there, and it's real here. So I don't see that for me, it wasn't any difference. I mean, it was just a different state of living or existing in eternity.
Have you asked yourself, why did this happen? Why at this time and where it happened?
Jeff, I asked myself that many times over the months that followed my collapse, because the doctor said, well, you got really lucky. You had staff there, you had EMTs close by, uh, you were assisted very quickly, uh, you didn't have any heart damage, even though you were dead for 6 minutes, no residual effects. Why became the default question for me for a long time. And that's what really motivated me to start writing notes about things I remembered, because I was trying to piece it together. I went and got all my medical reports. I got a 6-inch stack of that to explain what happened. I've got Mary's emails, because she had to keep everybody informed as to what I was doing. That's about 4-inch stack of papers. But it still didn't answer the question of why at that point in time. I had been out in our pasture that morning, an hour before, out in the middle of our cattle, which was really kind of interesting, because it wasn't in the middle of our cattle, because they had gotten spooked when they saw me coming. It was like they saw something was different, and I never had that problem with it. So I shrugged my shoulders and went back and went in. Now, it was less than an hour later when I collapsed at the uh, rehab fitness center, and I wasn't even exercising. Out in the pasture, I was walking. So I was actually physically moving. So it could have happened there, which would mean that we would not be having this discussion, because nobody would have found me until hours later, till Mary came home looking for me. So why did it happen there at that particular point in time? That was my biggest question. And the only thing I've been able to understand is that it happened there because I had help and I had something I needed to do yet in this life before I leave again. And that something was to write about my experience and what I experienced there. Although I didn't know it at the time when I went in that morning, uh, and show other people that there's nothing to fear. There's only hope out there. There's only love. You don't have to be afraid unless you choose to be, but that won't do you any good. Um, the the question why was the biggest one, and so that's become what to me is the answer. Is because I needed to write this for other people, and partly it was for me to understand it all, but it was also for other people to understand what is out in another dimension. And if I can take a moment, and this is somewhat off the track, for anyone who is listening to this, I would encourage them to thank their local EMTs and ambulance services. Oftentimes, they typically fly under the radar until they're needed, and then you're grateful for them. So be grateful for them now, beforehand, because they are worthy of your support. If it hadn't been for the ER and EMTs, I wouldn't have been here either. So it's not part of my experience, other than that they were the 11 people plus the 5 staff members who helped me. And they did it willingly. They didn't know, most of them didn't know who I was, but they put themselves through a lot of stress to get me to come back.
Phillip, after watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that? And if so, how do they contact you?
If they would like to email me at philiphasheider@gmail.com, sure. I would welcome anyone who has a comment. Uh, that would be the best way to get a hold of me.
Well, before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
The future, the eternal future, is all love. It is now. Everything is love. Everything is hope. And that, I believe, is why I returned to share this with you.
Phillip, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Well, thank you, Jeff. This has been a real pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity to share my story. There's a lot to it, but I think we've covered quite a bit of it, and I appreciate the chance to meet you and discuss this with you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.